when an arrogant cop mistreated a pregnant woman in a wheelchair. He had no idea he was seconds away from making the biggest mistake of his life. Her husband was watching, and he wasn't just any man. The scorching afternoon sun beat down on the bustling city streets, casting long shadows as pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks. Amidst the rush, a woman in a wheelchair waited at a crosswalk, her hands resting calmly on the wheels. Emily Carter was no ordinary woman. She was 6 months pregnant, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that made people glance twice. Dressed in a simple yet elegant dress, her auburn hair tucked neatly behind her ears, she was the kind of person most would overlook. The traffic light flickered to red, signaling pedestrians to cross. But just as Emily pushed herself forward, a sleek black SUV swerved past, barely missing her. A few people gasped. A man muttered something under his breath, but no one stopped. This was the city, fast, unforgiving, and indifferent. Emily exhaled slowly, tightening her grip on her wheels. She had been through worse. With steady determination, she began maneuvering across the street, but before she could reach the other side, a sharp voice sliced through the noise. "Hey, you can't be here." A police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped toward her, his mirrored sunglasses concealing his eyes. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the sun. Officer Blake. The way he carried himself exuded authority, the kind that didn't welcome defiance. Emily halted, looking up at him. "Excuse me?" Blake scoffed, crossing his arms. "You're blocking the way. Get off the street before you cause an accident." Emily glanced around. The pedestrian light was still green, and people were passing by without issue. She frowned. "I'm crossing legally." Blake's lips curled into a smirk. "Doesn't matter. You're holding up traffic." A few bystanders slowed down, sensing the tension, but no one intervened. That was the thing about authority. It silenced people, made them passive observers. Emily, however, remained calm. She was used to moments like this, being underestimated, being dismissed. She had spent years facing them with quiet resilience. "I'm not in anyone's way," she said evenly, her voice unwavering. Blake stepped closer, towering over her, his hand resting on his belt where his baton hung. "I said move." A young woman nearby, holding a cup of iced coffee, furrowed her brows as she watched. Something felt off about this. She whispered to her friend, "That cop's being weird. She's literally just trying to cross." But when her friend gave her a warning look, she fell silent. No one wanted trouble with the police. Emily remained in place, meeting Blake's gaze. She wasn't scared. She wasn't going to be intimidated. Then, Blake did something unexpected. He grabbed the handles of her wheelchair and yanked it backward. Gasps erupted from the small crowd gathering around. Emily's hands shot out, gripping the armrests as her body jerked from the sudden movement. "What the hell are you doing?" she snapped, her voice sharper now. Blake smirked, "Making sure you understand who's in charge here." A few people whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones, but no one dared to step in. They had seen how these situations ended before. What they didn't know, what Blake had no clue about, was that Emily was far from alone. She calmly reached into her bag and sent a single message. A simple action, quick and effortless. Across the city, inside a sleek high-rise federal building, a phone buzzed on a polished wooden desk. And with that, the course of the afternoon shifted entirely. The city kept moving, indifferent to the scene unfolding in the middle of the crosswalk. Cars honked impatiently, pedestrians sidestepped the commotion, and Officer Blake stood firm, his grip tightening on the wheelchair's handles. Emily refused to look shaken. She adjusted her posture, her face unreadable, but inside, her pulse drummed against her skin. "Let go of my chair," she said, her voice measured but firm. Blake let out a short laugh. "Or what? You gonna roll away?" His voice dripped with condescension, and the crowd murmured in discomfort. Emily exhaled through her nose. She had encountered power-hungry men before, men who mistook patience for weakness and restraint for submission. They all made the same mistake. A businessman in a suit hesitated nearby, his phone in hand, but after a quick glance at Blake's badge, he stuffed it back into his pocket and hurried off. Others whispered, their expressions uneasy, but no one stepped forward. Blake smirked, thriving in the absence of resistance. He leaned down slightly, his voice dropping just for her. "You see, lady, I don't like being challenged, and right now, you're making me look bad." Emily held his gaze, her grip tightening on her phone. "Number, you're making yourself look bad." His smirk faltered. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, and then he made his biggest mistake. With one swift motion, Blake yanked Emily's wheelchair back another foot, hard enough that the wheels skidded against the pavement. Her body jerked, and her stomach twisted with the sudden force. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. "Hey!" a voice called out. A man in his 20s, his phone now lifted. Blake turned sharply. "Mind your damn business." Emily steadied herself, suppressing the instinctive wave of nausea that came from being jolted so suddenly. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, she said, "You're going to regret that." Blake scoffed. "Oh yeah? What, you gonna sue me? File a complaint?" He took a step back, adjusting his belt like a man who thought he had already won. Emily's lips parted slightly, in what could almost be mistaken for a smile. But it wasn't amusement. "No," she said softly. "I already made a call." Blake's head tilted, his expression shifting slightly. A call? And then, a single phone rang, a piercing, mechanical sound cutting through the tension. Not Emily's, not anyone in the crowd. It was Blake's radio, a crackle, then a voice. "All units, stand by. Immediate hold on Officer Blake. Orders from FBI headquarters. Do not engage. Back up en route." Blake froze. His smirk vanished. Every muscle in his body locked up at once. A tense silence fell over the street. The weight of those words settled like a storm cloud. Orders from FBI headquarters? Blake's fingers twitched toward his radio, but before he could even respond, sirens erupted in the distance. Not just one, not just two. 4 black SUVs, unmarked, sleek, and moving with terrifying precision, turned sharply onto the street, tires screeching as they came to an abrupt stop, right at the curb. Doors flew open, and stepping out, adjusting his sleeves as if he had all the time in the world, was Daniel Carter. Blake didn't recognize him at first. He saw the tailored vest, the sharp jawline, the cold, calculated way the man scanned the situation. But then, the badge. FBI. Not just any agent. Special Agent Daniel Carter. Blake's mouth went dry. Emily, still seated in her wheelchair, exhaled slowly. She hadn't looked worried for a second. Daniel's gaze locked onto Blake like a predator sizing up its prey. The air grew impossibly thick. Then, in a voice as calm as it was lethal, he said, "Step away from my wife." The moment Daniel Carter stepped onto the street, the world seemed to slow. His sharp blue eyes locked onto Blake like a predator, assessing its prey. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. His presence alone sent a ripple of unease through the air. The sirens had already silenced, but the weight of their arrival lingered. Pedestrians, who just moments ago had been too afraid to intervene, now stopped in their tracks, phones raised, sensing something bigger than they understood was about to unfold. Blake, still gripping his radio, stared at Daniel, confusion flickering across his face. Then, as if his ego refused to accept the shift in power, he straightened his shoulders and sneered. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" Blake scoffed, trying to inject his voice with the same arrogance he'd used against Emily. Daniel didn't blink, didn't react. He simply took one measured step forward. Step away from my wife. His voice was calm, too calm, a stillness that carried an unmistakable promise of consequence. Blake hesitated. A flicker of doubt passed through his expression, but then, just as quickly, he masked it with bravado. "Oh, this your husband?" He laughed, gesturing to Emily, his tone laced with mockery. "What, you think showing up with a couple of fancy SUVs is supposed to scare me? You got a badge? Let me see some ID, tough guy." Daniel exhaled slowly, his patience thinner than glass. With deliberate precision, he reached into his coat and pulled out a badge, FBI. But it wasn't just any badge. The silver emblem gleamed under the afternoon sun, and next to it, a name that sent an almost imperceptible tremor through Blake's stance. Daniel Carter. Not just an agent, not just some desk jockey, special agent in charge, a man with the authority to shut down entire operations, a man who didn't ask twice. The moment Blake read the name, the blood drained from his face. He knew that name. Everybody in law enforcement did. The FBI's bulldog. The agent they called in when things needed to be handled, discreetly and without loose ends. And he had just assaulted his wife. The realization settled into Blake's stomach like lead, but his pride, the same pride that had driven him to throw his weight around against a pregnant woman, refused to let him back down. "I don't care who you are," he spat, shoving his badge forward like a shield. "This is my jurisdiction. She was obstructing traffic, and I was handling it." Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if he were studying a bug under a microscope. "Handling it?" he repeated, his tone devoid of emotion. Emily, still seated in her wheelchair, simply watched. She knew her husband well enough to recognize that this wasn't anger. This was calculation. And for Blake, that was far worse. Daniel stepped closer, slow, methodical, closing the distance between them until there was barely a foot of space left. He was taller, broader, and unlike Blake, he didn't need to prove his authority. He was authority. "Tell me something, Officer Blake," Daniel said smoothly. "When exactly did the law change to justify roughing up a pregnant woman in a wheelchair?" Blake's jaw clenched. "I told you. She was obstructing traffic. She refused to move when I asked her to." Daniel glanced at Emily, then back at Blake. His eyes were unreadable, but his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent years interrogating criminals, who thought they were untouchable. "And you thought yanking her wheelchair like a piece of luggage was the appropriate response?" The crowd around them was dead silent. Even the officers who had arrived in the SUVs stood still, waiting. The only sound was the occasional rustling of wind against fabric, the faint beeping of a pedestrian light in the distance. Blake swallowed. His hands twitched, a subtle tell of a man who realized he was running out of excuses. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Look, I don't need to explain myself to you. You might be some big-shot Fed, but out here, I make the calls." He jabbed a finger toward Daniel's chest. "So, unless you want to be arrested for interfering with an officer, I suggest you take your wife and leave." Wrong move. Before the last syllable had even left Blake's lips, Daniel's hand shot up, faster than anyone could process, and caught Blake's wrist mid-air. The motion was so precise, so controlled, that it didn't even look aggressive. It looked practiced. Blake flinched. He tried to yank his hand back, but Daniel didn't let go. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. The shift in power was undeniable. Blake wasn't the one in control anymore. Daniel was. Interfering? Daniel repeated, his grip tightening just enough to make his point. You think I'm interfering? Blake couldn't move. His bravado cracked. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Daniel leaned in, voice lower now, but sharp as a blade. You put your hands on my wife. A beat of silence. And then, you put your hands on me. Blake exhaled sharply, trying to cover the fact that his pulse was thundering beneath Daniel's grip. Daniel didn't move, didn't blink. Then, he let go. Blake stumbled back, nearly tripping over himself, his face flushed with anger, but also something dangerously close to fear. Daniel straightened, adjusting his cuffs with the ease of a man who knew he had already won. Now, Daniel continued, his voice effortlessly composed. Are you going to arrest yourself, or do I need to make a few calls? Blake's hands curled into fists. His breathing was uneven. He was cornered, and he knew it. And for the first time, in front of the watching crowd, he looked small. Blake's jaw clenched so tightly, his teeth might crack. His face burned, a mixture of rage and humiliation coursing through him as he stood there, fists balled, the weight of the crowd's silent judgment pressing down on him. He had spent years controlling situations like this, thriving on intimidation, making people feel small. But now, he was the one shrinking. His authority, something he had always wielded like a weapon, was slipping through his fingers, like sand. And the man standing in front of him, calm, composed, utterly unshaken, was the reason why. Daniel Carter hadn't raised his voice, hadn't threatened. He didn't need to. The mere presence of a man like him was enough to make the world stop and take notice. For the first time, Blake truly looked at him, not just as some big-shot Fed who had interrupted his day, but as a man who had power in a way Blake never would. And worse, a man who wasn't afraid to use it. Blake exhaled sharply, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. You're overstepping, he spat. This is my jurisdiction. I don't care if you're FBI. You can't just walk in here and... I already did, Daniel interrupted smoothly. Blake stiffened. And let me make something clear, Daniel continued, voice even, unwavering. You don't have a jurisdiction anymore. As of 5 minutes ago, your badge is suspended pending an official investigation. You assaulted a civilian. You abused your authority. And worse, you thought you could get away with it. Blake's breath caught in his throat. The words hit him harder than any punch ever could. Suspended, his badge, his career, his power. Gone? His eyes darted to the other officers looking for support, for someone, anyone, who would push back against this. But none of them moved. None of them spoke. The realization settled into his bones like ice. He was alone. The bystanders, the people who had once looked away in fear, were now watching him fall. And Emily? Emily hadn't moved an inch. She sat there, hands resting in her lap, her expression unreadable. But her eyes saw everything. Blake's stomach twisted. For the first time since this all started, he understood something terrifying. She had never been afraid of him. Not once. Because she had always known how this would end. With him standing there, stripped of the power he had once flaunted, with nothing left but the weight of his own actions, crushing him into the ground. The radio on his shoulder crackled. Officer Blake, return to base immediately. Internal Affairs is en route. The final nail in the coffin. Blake swallowed. His hands trembled, not from anger, but from something else, something he refused to name. Shame. Defeat. He turned to Daniel one last time, but the man had already shifted his attention elsewhere. To his wife. Daniel crouched beside Emily, his hand resting gently on hers. His voice softened. "Are you okay?" She nodded once, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Took you long enough." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "I like to make an entrance." Blake stood there, forgotten, dismissed like an afterthought. And in that moment, he realized. He had lost everything. The street, once filled with murmurs and whispers, now felt impossibly still. Officer Blake stood frozen, the weight of his downfall pressing into his chest like a vice. The badge pinned to his uniform, once a symbol of his authority, now felt like an anchor, dragging him under. The officers from Daniel's team didn't need to say a word. Two of them stepped forward, their movements precise and deliberate. One unclipped the radio from Blake's shoulder. The other reached for his belt, unclasping his holster. "Hands where we can see them," one of them ordered. Blake hesitated, his pride screaming at him to resist. But there was no fight left to win, no way out. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he lifted his hands. The moment his fingers left his belt, his badge was unpinned. And just like that, he was no longer a cop. A murmur rippled through the crowd, people shifting on their feet as they watched a man who once exuded absolute power stand there, powerless. Blake's breath came in shallow bursts. He turned, seeking something, someone, to latch onto. But his fellow officers wouldn't even meet his gaze. They had already moved on. And Emily? She was still there, still seated in her wheelchair, still looking at him. Not with fear, not with anger, with pity. That was the final blow. Daniel exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing as he turned his full attention back to his wife. "Do you want to press charges?" one of the agents asked. Emily considered it. She let the silence stretch, let Blake feel every second of it. Then, after a beat, she shook her head. "No." Blake's head snapped up, disbelief flashing across his face. "No." Emily's gaze never wavered. "You're already done. There's nothing left for me to do." Blake looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to say something, but the words never came. And so, for the first time in his life, he had no choice but to walk away. Blake's footsteps were heavy as he walked away, each step dragging like dead weight. The crowd slowly began to disperse, whispers fading into the hum of the city. Some people kept recording, others just shook their heads, but no one stopped him. No one cared. For a man who had built his entire existence on power and control, this was the cruelest punishment of all. Emily took a slow breath, the tension finally leaving her body. Daniel, ever the gentleman, crouched beside her and adjusted the footrest on her wheelchair before lifting her hand to his lips in a quiet act of reassurance. "Ready to go?" he murmured. Emily smirked. "As long as you're the one pushing." Daniel chuckled, standing up and rolling her forward as if they had just finished an ordinary errand. As they moved, a voice called out from the sidewalk. "Ma'am?" Emily turned. It was the young woman from earlier, the one who had hesitated when she saw Blake's behavior, but hadn't stepped in. She shifted nervously, guilt flickering in her eyes. "I should have said something sooner," she admitted. Emily studied her for a moment, then smiled. "You see it now, though. Next time, say something." The woman nodded, understanding the weight of those words, and with that, Emily and Daniel disappeared into the city, because justice had already been served. Some people think power is about how loud you are, how much fear you can create. But real power is knowing when to act and when to let the world reveal the truth on its own. What would you have done in this situation? Let me know in the comments. And if you love stories where justice finds its way, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. because sometimes karma just needs a little push.